This is a recording for Chapter 1 titled Intro to Psychology. First of all, we need to define what psychology is. It is the scientific study of behavioral and mental processes, including the way we think and feel. So it's essentially the way we act, the way we think, and the way we feel. It's studying all those things, and it seeks to describe, explain, predict, and control behavior and the way we think and feel. So what does that mean? For example, a behavior a consumer psychologist might study is, why do consumers buy certain items? Why do they have this behavior of buying certain things as opposed to others? A mental process, the way we think and feel, that a clinical psychologist might study is anxiety. So again, I think the main point is just to remember that psychology is the study of the way we behave, the way we think, and the way we feel. So what exactly do psychologists do? Some do research to describe, explain, and predict how we behave and think and feel. Some practice. This is probably the most common perception of psychologists that we have, is the counselor who's in the room with the client and doing therapy with that person. So they practice to control behavioral and mental processes. And some psychologists teach to train students of psychology, conduct workshops and seminars. There are some sub-disciplines of psychology. A couple of those are cognitive psychology, which is the study of how people perceive, remember, think, speak, and solve problems. The question they ask is, how do our thoughts affect our behavior? How does what we think affect the way we act? Developmental psychology is the study of how thought and behavior change and remain stable across the lifespan. The main words there are lifespan. Does the way we think, for example, change across our lifespan? Does the way we behave and the way we feel change throughout our life? Biological psychology is the study of the relationship between bodily systems, so between the physical body, and chemicals, and how they influence our behavior and thought. A biological psychologist might ask the question, how do serotonin levels within the body affect depression? As you might know, most or a lot of antidepressants, such as Prozac or Zoloft, Wellbutrin, and there's many more, affect the serotonin levels in our body because we know that affects your depression level. So that's what biological psychologists would study. Another subdiscipline is personality psychology, which is the study of what makes people unique and the consistencies in people's behavior across time and situations. Another definition of personality refers to the enduring characteristics and behavior that comprise a person's unique adjustment to life, including their major traits, their interests, what drives them, their values, their self-concept, how they see themselves, their abilities, and their emotional patterns. So a question a personality psychologist might ask is, does someone with a friendly personality experience less stress than someone with an anxious personality? So they look at the types of personalities and want to know how their behavior might be different or how they think might be different. Social psychologists study how living among others influences how we think and act and feel. In other words, how do we affect each other? Example, is my behavior influenced by my friend's behavior? Cross-cultural psychology is exactly what it sounds like. It's the study of how we think, feel, behave. Mental illness is similar across different cultures around the world. So how does our culture affect our psychology? For example, a question a cross-cultural psychologist might ask is, do Americans experience more depression than people in other countries? Clinical psychology is probably, as I mentioned earlier, the most popular type of psychology, or it's what we think of when we think of a psychologist. It's that person in the room who's doing therapy with another person. The diagnosis and treatment of mental, emotional, and behavioral disorders, and the promotion of psychological health. So that psychologist is going to diagnose, for example, they may diagnose depression, and then say, how do we treat that? How do we treat depression? How do we treat the way a depressed person thinks and feels and behaves? So, again, that's probably the most common view we have of psychology. A few other subdisciplines include health psychology, educational, industrial, organizational, sports psychology, community psychology, evolutionary psychology, and forensic psychology. And all of those should be found in your textbook, so if any of those sound particularly interesting, I would encourage you to look at that. So when did the study of psychology start? When did someone think, oh, we need to study the way we think and the way we feel and the way we behave? Well, it began more than 2,000 years ago with the Greek philosophers Socrates and Aristotle. But we're going to jump way ahead to the 1800s. William James became the figure of psychology in the US. He came up with the term functionalism. In other words, he asked the question, how does someone's life experiences help them become more adapted to their environment? In other words, he felt that there's a relationship between what we experience in life and how we behave. Jumping ahead another 50 to 100 years, John Watson and B.F. Skinner introduced the concept of behaviorism. That focuses more on someone's behavior than the way they think and feel. Watson and Skinner believed that psychologists should only study that which is observable, which is their behavior. Of course, you can't observe the way we think and the way we feel. So they thought you should only study our behavior. Around the same time as Watson and Skinner, Sigmund Freud, who most of us have heard of, introduced the concept of psychoanalysis. Psychoanalysis, like William James Freud, also felt that there was a relationship between our life experience and our behavior. He especially felt that our childhood experiences would have an effect on our future behavior. The more modern humanistic existential perspective believes that our behavior is not just determined by our childhood experiences, but that our behavior continues to be shaped and changed throughout our lives. So we're not locked in to what we experience as a child, but we continue to grow and change throughout our lives. So how do psychologists explain how humans think, feel, and behave? There are 7 primary perspectives used to provide this explanation. Of course, though, our thoughts, emotions, and behaviors don't always fit just one perspective. We're way too complicated for that. And the chart on the next slide, which you may want to review, offers a good overview of each perspective. I'm not going to go through the whole chart because it's a lot of information, but you might want to take the time to look at it. It offers a good summary of each perspective and the questions each perspective is going to ask. Nature versus nurture is a common question asked in psychology. In other words, is our behavior, the way we think, the way we feel, is that more determined by genetics, which is nature, the biological transmission of traits, or is it more determined by nurture, which is your environment? An environment may include your culture, the people in your household, even your level of nutrition, your level of education. And as you might imagine, the environment surrounding us as children, as Floyd thought, appears to be the most influential on our future thoughts and behavior. So evolution and heredity, which is heredity is essentially the nature portion. Charles Darwin's theory of natural selection says that species that are better adapted to their environment are more likely to survive and reproduce. The survival of a species permits them to reach sexual maturity, to reproduce, and to transmit their features or traits to the next generation. I think that's a lot, but it's really just saying that people with traits that are more adaptable to their environment, that can survive the longest, are more likely to carry on. Those genes are more likely to carry on to reproduce and create those features and traits in the next generation. So that's all I have for this presentation. I know that's a lot of information, but it's not nearly the amount of information that's in your textbook. So if you do have any questions about anything I discussed or anything in your textbook, please let me know. I don't mind at all to answer those. Thanks a lot.